When you hear the words Black Panther Party, chances are the first thing that comes to mind is not food on a plate, or a doctor taking blood pressure, or a classroom filled with children learning their history. More likely, you see the images America was shown again and again on television. Young black men and women marching in formation, rifles in their hands, fists raised high, staring down police officers or state officials. To millions, that image came to symbolize not only the Panthers, but an entire chapter of American history defined by unrest, rebellion, and fear. But what if I told you that the image was only half the story, and that it was the half deliberately chosen for you to see? What if I told you that behind the leather jackets and the raised fists was a network of community programs so effective, so revolutionary, and so threatening to the established order that the FBI declared them the single greatest internal threat to the United States? Imagine that. Not foreign enemies, not organized crime, but breakfast for children. Why? Because feeding the hungry proved something powerful. It proved that a neglected community could care for itself. It proved that people who had been written off by the system didn't need the system's permission to survive. It proved that dignity could be built from the ground up. But that is not how most people remember the Panthers. Instead, the story that dominates the public mind is one of militancy, confrontation, and danger. Tonight, we're going to step behind that version of history. We're going to revisit the world the Panthers were born into, follow their rise, explore the survival programs they built, and see how the state moved heaven and earth to erase those achievements. By the end, you may never look at those black berets the same way again. To understand the Black Panther Party, we have to step into America of the mid-1960s. The Civil Rights Movement had won historic victories: the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. On paper, segregation was outlawed, and voting rights were secured. But the reality in cities like Oakland, Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles told a different story. Black communities were still trapped in cycles of poverty, unemployment, poor housing, and unequal schooling. Police harassment was not the exception. It was the daily reality. In Oakland, California, two young men, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, watched this world closely. Newton was brilliant, self-educated in law and philosophy, while Seale was charismatic, a skilled organizer with a sharp sense of strategy. Together, they believed that the dream of equality promised by the civil rights movement had fallen short. They were inspired by thinkers like Malcolm X, by anti-colonial movements around the world, and by the immediate needs of their neighbors. In October 1966, they founded the Black Panther Party for self-defense. That last part, self-defense, is crucial. Their initial mission was not to launch an armed revolution, but to protect their communities from constant police violence. And their methods were bold. California law at the time allowed the open carry of firearms, so Panthers began trailing police cars, law books in hand, rifles slung over their shoulders. They would watch as officers stopped and questioned black residents, reminding both officer and civilian of their legal rights. If a line was crossed, the Panthers were there as witnesses, protectors, and, if need be, a show of force. It was shocking for America to see. For decades, black citizens had been denied not only power, but the right to claim public space. Suddenly, here were young men and women standing tall, armed not just with weapons, but with knowledge of the law, declaring they would no longer be passive in the face of brutality. Newspapers and television cameras couldn't get enough of it. The image of armed black youth confronting authority made sensational headlines. And in that moment, a narrative was set. The Panthers were militants, radicals, extremists. But Newton and Seal never meant for the Panthers to be only about confrontation. They saw their patrols as just one part of a larger vision, to build communities that could survive and thrive independently of a system that had failed them. And that's where the real heart of the Panther story begins, not with guns, but with groceries. The Panthers looked around at their neighborhoods and saw problems everywhere: hunger, lack of health care, failing schools, unemployment. They also saw a government that had either ignored those problems or caused them. So they asked themselves a simple question: what if we solved these problems ourselves? In January 1969, in Oakland, they launched the Free Breakfast for Children program. It was humble at first, volunteers rising before dawn, cooking scrambled eggs, oatmeal, and grits in borrowed kitchens. Children from the neighborhood lined up, many of them arriving hungry from homes where food was scarce. They ate, laughed, and went to school with full stomachs. The idea spread quickly. Soon, Panthers were serving breakfast in cities across America, from Los Angeles to Chicago to New York. By the end of the year, tens of thousands of children were eating free meals provided not by the government, but by the Panthers. Teachers noticed the change. Students were more alert, more focused, better able to learn. Parents noticed too, and their gratitude turned into support for the Panthers. But breakfast was only one program among many. The Panthers opened over a dozen free community health clinics, staffed by volunteer doctors and nurses. They offered checkups, dental care, and health education. They pioneered large-scale testing for sickle-cell anemia, a genetic disease that disproportionately affected African Americans, but had been largely ignored by medical institutions until the Panthers forced it onto the national agenda. They distributed free clothing and groceries. They ran after-school programs where children learned not only reading and math, but also the history of Africa, of slavery, of resistance, and of Black achievement, a curriculum missing from mainstream schools. They organized senior escort services, ensuring that elderly neighbors could get to the store or the doctor safely. In New York, they even created a free ambulance service, because city services often ignored Black neighborhoods. Altogether, the Panthers launched more than 60 different community programs. They called them survival programs pending revolution. That phrase is telling. They didn't see these as charity. They saw them as lifelines, as proof that a neglected people could provide for themselves while building power for the future. Every plate of food, every bandaged wound, every history lesson was both practical and political. It said, "We are not waiting for justice. We are making survival possible, right now." For all of their community work, the Panthers were still labeled the most dangerous domestic group in America. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, said outright that the free breakfast program was the greatest internal threat to national security. Think about that for a moment. Not riots, not violence, not radical speeches. Breakfast. Why? Because feeding children exposed a brutal truth, that the government itself had failed. The Panthers were showing that ordinary citizens, even those demonized and marginalized, could do for themselves what the state refused to. And that was terrifying to those in power. A hungry child is a problem. A child fed by their own community, outside of state control, is a challenge to the system. The Panthers weren't just serving food, they were teaching self-determination. They were showing what power could look like when built from the bottom up. They weren't asking permission, They weren't begging for reform, and they weren't waiting on legislation. They were acting, and their success embarrassed officials, threatened politicians, and unnerved law enforcement. So, while the Panthers handed out food, medicine and books, newspapers and television focused on their guns. While clinics quietly treated patients, headlines shouted about extremists. The narrative wasn't accidental. It was carefully curated to make the public afraid, to make support for the Panthers seem unthinkable. And when fear didn't work, the state escalated its war on the movement. The FBI had long targeted civil rights leaders, from Martin Luther King Jr. to Malcolm X. But with the Panthers, their campaign reached a new level. Under COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, the FBI's mission was clear: to neutralize the Black Panther Party before it grew too powerful. Agents infiltrated chapters across the country. They mailed fake letters designed to sow division between leaders. They spread false rumors, accusing members of betrayal. They turned allies against each other. And when disinformation wasn't enough, they used force. Police raided Panther offices, often in the middle of the night, destroying records, seizing food and supplies, and arresting members on trumped-up charges. Some raids ended in violence. The most infamous came in Chicago in December 1969. Fred Hampton, the 21-year-old Panther leader, was one of the most promising voices of his generation. Charismatic, intelligent, and fearless, Hampton had organized massive free breakfast programs, opened health clinics, and perhaps most dangerously to the establishment, built multiracial coalitions with poor whites and Latinos. He called it the Rainbow Coalition. The FBI could not allow this. So, working with local police, they set up a raid. In the early hours of December 4th, officers stormed Hampton's apartment. They fired nearly 100 rounds. Hampton, drugged in his sleep by an informant, never woke up. He was killed in his bed next to his pregnant partner. The state called it a shootout. Evidence later revealed it was an assassination. Hampton's death was not an isolated incident. Across the country, Panther offices were attacked, leaders jailed, and programs dismantled. What could have been a nationwide movement for community survival was instead strangled under the weight of surveillance, violence, and fear. When the dust settled, the story that remained was not one of community care, but one of militancy. The narrative stuck. To many Americans, the Black Panthers became symbols of radical extremism, remembered more for leather jackets and rifles than for clinics and classrooms. The government's strategy had worked. They had not only disrupted the Panthers' programs, they had buried their memory beneath a mountain of fear. And yet, the legacy of the Panthers endures in ways many don't realize. The free breakfast program directly inspired the federal government to expand its own school breakfast program, which today serves millions of children. Awareness of sickle-cell anemia skyrocketed, leading to federal research and treatment programs. The idea of community clinics took root in cities across America, and the notion of grassroots, community-based solutions remains at the heart of activism today. Still, the misremembering matters, because when history portrays the Panthers only as militants, it erases the dignity they restored to their communities. It erases the thousands of full stomachs, the countless patients treated, the children taught to take pride in their heritage. It erases the radical idea that survival itself can be resistance. So now, we return to the question we began with. When history remembers the Black Panthers, whose memory are we repeating? The government's, which wanted you to fear them, or the communities which remembered them as neighbors, caregivers, and builders of hope. History is never neutral. It is shaped by those who tell it, by the powerful who choose what to amplify and what to bury. The story of the Panthers reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous act in the eyes of the state isn't protest, it's compassion. Not the raised fist, but the plate of food handed to a hungry child. Not the confrontation in the street, but the quiet dignity of a free clinic. The Panthers dared to imagine survival as resistance, and for that they were targeted, discredited, and erased from memory. But memory can be reclaimed. We can remember them not just as militants, but as visionaries, not just as fighters, but as builders. And if we do, we may also begin to ask, what other truths have been buried by fear? What other legacies have been lost to propaganda? What else in American history is waiting to be seen whole, not in fragments? This has been Untold Secrets of American History. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, keep questioning the stories you've been told. Keep searching for the truths beneath the headlines. And remember, the past is never just about what happened. It's about what we choose to remember.